What? How could she fall in love again? That was the question everyone whispered the night Margaret Wilson smiled again. At 78, Margaret had learned how to live quietly. Her modern Chicago apartment was neat, calm, and predictable, just the way she liked it. The walls held framed photos of a life already lived, a wedding picture from 50 years ago, children now grown and scattered across the country, and a husband whose absence still felt louder than any noise. She wasn't lonely, she told herself. She had routines: morning walks, evening news, weekly calls with her daughter, Claire. Love, she believed, was something she had already used up. So when she laughed at the cafe downstairs, really laughed, people noticed. The barista paused. A neighbor looked up from his phone. Margaret hadn't laughed like that in years. Across the small table sat a man she barely knew. His name was Thomas. He had kind eyes, steady hands, and a voice that carried patience instead of urgency. They were supposed to be strangers sharing coffee after a building meeting, nothing more. Yet something stirred. Margaret felt it before she understood it, a warmth she hadn't felt since she was young. It frightened her. It confused her. At her age, hearts weren't supposed to wake up, and yet hers had. Margaret didn't sleep well that night. She lay in bed listening to the distant hum of traffic, annoyed with herself for replaying a simple conversation again and again. Thomas hadn't said anything special, no flirting, no grand words, just stories about his late wife, his years working as a city engineer, the way retirement felt louder than he expected. Still, something had shifted. The next morning, Margaret tried to shake it off. She folded laundry, watered her plants, watched her favorite morning show. Yet her thoughts kept drifting back to the cafe downstairs, to the calm way Thomas listened, to how he didn't rush her words. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself. At 78, she knew better. Feelings led to disappointment. Expectations led to pain. She had buried her husband 15 years ago and promised herself she would never reopen that door. Later that afternoon, she stepped into the elevator and froze. Thomas stood inside, holding a grocery bag, looking just as surprised to see her. "Margaret," he said gently, "good afternoon." Her heart skipped. She hated that it did. They rode down together in polite silence. When the doors opened, he hesitated. "Would you like to sit for coffee again sometime?" Margaret opened her mouth to say no. Instead, she heard herself say, "Maybe." Margaret's daughter, Claire, noticed the change before anyone else. "You sound different," Claire said over the phone that evening. "Lighter." Margaret bristled. "I'm fine." But after the call ended, she sat quietly on her couch, staring at the old wedding photo on her shelf. She remembered the day it was taken, the joy, the certainty, the belief that love lasted forever. It hadn't. That memory had taught her caution. The next time she met Thomas, they walked slowly through a nearby city park. The benches were new, the paths clean, the skyline familiar. Everything felt modern, except the feelings stirring inside her. "I'm not looking for anything," Margaret said suddenly. Thomas nodded. "Neither am I." That answer surprised her. They spoke of small things, favorite books, music from their youth, the odd loneliness of growing old in a fast-moving world. As they parted, Thomas said softly, "I enjoy your company, that's all." Margaret walked home unsettled, because she enjoyed his too, and that frightened her more than loneliness ever had. By the third week, people were talking. Neighbors noticed Margaret's new routine: coffee downstairs twice a week, longer walks, a smile she no longer tried to hide. One woman leaned in and whispered, "Good for you." Another shook her head. At her age? The words stung more than Margaret expected. That evening, Claire visited. She watched her mother move around the kitchen, calmer than she'd been in years. "There's someone, isn't there?" Claire asked carefully. Margaret paused, then nodded. Claire sighed. "Mom, I just don't want you hurt." "So do I," Margaret replied. "That's why I've kept my distance." But distance was getting harder. That night, Thomas called. His voice was unsteady. "I was wondering, would you come with me to a small concert this weekend, just as friends?" Margaret closed her eyes. She thought of her age, of the past, of all the reasons not to go. Then she thought of the quiet warmth she felt around him. "I'll come," she said, and for the first time, she didn't regret the choice. The concert hall was modest, tucked between tall office buildings, soft lights, comfortable seats, the kind of place that didn't demand youth. As the music began, Margaret felt something unexpected, a deep calm. Halfway through, her hand brushed Thomas's. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. The contact was simple, respectful, yet it sent a tremor through her chest that made her eyes sting. After the concert, they lingered outside. City lights reflected off the sidewalk. Thomas cleared his throat. "I need to say something. I don't know what this is. I don't want to rush it, but I care." Margaret looked at him, truly looked, not as a man, not as a possibility, as a human being who understood loss. "I care too," she admitted, "and that scares me." Thomas smiled softly. "It scares me as well." They didn't touch again. They didn't need to, because both of them knew something had begun, and neither knew where it would lead.
Margaret woke the next morning with a familiar tightness in her chest. Not excitement, but fear. Caring was dangerous. Caring meant losing control. She had survived grief once, barely. She wasn't sure she could do it again. She skipped coffee that day, ignored the phone when Thomas called, told herself this was wisdom, not cowardice. By evening, guilt crept in. When she finally called him back, her voice was firm. "I need space." There was a pause. Then Thomas said quietly, "I understand." He didn't argue, didn't beg. That kindness hurt more than anger ever could. That night, Margaret sat alone, staring at the city lights outside her window. She realized something unsettling. She wasn't afraid of Thomas leaving. She was afraid of how much she would miss him if he did. A week passed, then another. Margaret's days felt longer. The apartment felt quieter. The silence she once mastered now felt heavy. During a routine doctor's visit, her physician smiled. "Your blood pressure's improved. Something changed?" Margaret hesitated, then said softly, "I let myself feel again." That evening, she found an old letter from her late husband, one she hadn't opened in years. In it, he had written, "Don't close your heart because of me. Love doesn't replace love, it adds to it." Tears came freely. She picked up the phone. "Thomas?" she said when he answered. "I was wrong to pull away." "I was hoping you'd call," he replied. For the first time, Margaret didn't second-guess herself. Not everyone celebrated their closeness. A neighbor made a comment. "At your age, what's the point?" Margaret surprised herself by answering calmly, "The point is being alive." Claire watched from the sidelines, conflicted but observant. One afternoon, she said, "I haven't seen you this present in years." Neither had Margaret. Thomas invited her to dinner. Nothing fancy, just home-cooked food and conversation that felt easy. At the table, he took her hand. "I won't promise forever," he said gently, "but I promise honesty." Margaret squeezed his hand. That's more than enough. The world could whisper, doubt could linger, but what they shared was real. On a quiet evening, Thomas brought Margaret to the rooftop of their building. The city stretched endlessly before them. "I don't want to waste time," he said gently, "not because we're old, but because we know what matters." Margaret's heart raced. "I don't need marriage," he continued. "I just want to choose you, every day I can." Margaret looked at the skyline, then back at him. I spent years thinking my heart was finished. Turns out it was only waiting. She leaned in, resting her head against his shoulder. At 78, love didn't arrive loudly. It arrived honestly. Months later, Margaret walked through the park with Thomas hand in hand, unhurried. She still lived alone, still valued her independence, but love had found a new shape, gentle, steady, and deeply respectful. Claire watched from the sidelines, smiling. That night, Margaret stood by her window, city lights glowing below. She whispered to herself, "I didn't fall in love again because I was young." She smiled. "I fell in love because I was brave." At 78, she had learned the truth no one talks about. Love doesn't belong to age. It belongs to the willing heart. And hers was open. At last.